Europe is doing what every rational power would do. It is aligning with strength. It is securing protection. It is integrating with the world's largest economies. In a world defined by two superpowers, the United States and China, this is not weakness. It is strategy. When giants compete, middle powers move closer to one of them. You reduce exposure. You hedge risk. You lock instability. On paper, Europe's moves make sense. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe doubled down on transatlantic security. NATO expanded, defense coordination intensified, energy imports shifted toward the United States. At the same time, Europe maintained deep commercial ties with China, its largest trading partner in goods for years. European automakers rely on Chinese battery supply chains. German exports depend on Chinese demand. Green transition technologies are deeply intertwined. This is not indecision, it is integration. And integration should increase leverage. So why does something feel off? Because the more Europe embeds itself in these external systems, the narrower its independent maneuvering space appears to become. That is the paradox. Alignment promises strength, but strength and autonomy are not identical. Historically, Europe was not merely a participant in global power structures, it was an architect. From maritime empires to financial institutions, from industrial revolutions to regulatory regimes, Europe helped define global rules. Today, many of those rules are written elsewhere. Washington shapes security doctrine and financial infrastructure. Beijing shapes manufacturing scale and supply chain gravity. Europe remains influential, but influence is not control. Control means setting direction. Influence often means negotiating within someone else's direction. Now, some would argue this framing is exaggerated. Europe still has enormous GDP. It has advanced technology. It sets global standards in data privacy and competition law. It remains a regulatory superpower. And that is true. Europe is not collapsing. It is not irrelevant. It is not weak. But power in the 21st century is less about size and more about structural leverage. It is about who controls energy pricing, who anchors advanced manufacturing, who defines financial plumbing, who sets the security ceiling. If those systems are increasingly shaped outside your borders, your room to maneuver changes, even if your GDP does not. The paradox is subtle. Europe aligns for stability, but stability can come at the cost of optionality, and optionality is leverage. So here's the uncomfortable question. If aligning with power is meant to strengthen Europe, why does every step closer seem to make independent action more expensive? Before we decide whether Europe is losing, we need to confront a harder question. What does power actually mean in the modern world? Because power is often misunderstood. It's not just GDP. It's not population size. It's not how many global summits you host or how many speeches your leaders give. Power in the 21st century is structural. It rests on control over systems. And today, 4 systems determine whether a region truly holds leverage: energy, industry, security, finance. Start with energy. If you don't control the cost and stability of your energy supply, you don't control your industrial competitiveness. Energy determines production costs. Production costs determine investment. Investment determines long-term growth. After Russian gas flows collapsed, Europe scrambled to secure alternative supplies. Liquefied natural gas imports from the United States surged. Storage levels stabilized. The lights stayed on. But energy stability is not the same as energy leverage. During key periods, European energy prices remained significantly higher than in the United States. And capital responds to price differentials. When energy becomes structurally more expensive, heavy industry recalculates. Investment shifts. Long-term competitiveness erodes quietly, not through crisis, but through cost. Now consider industry. Industrial power is not just about producing goods. It's about anchoring supply chains, retaining advanced manufacturing capacity, keeping innovation ecosystems local. When factories move, expertise moves. When expertise moves, strategic capacity moves. Recent large-scale industrial subsidies in the United States, particularly in clean technology and semiconductors, created powerful incentives for capital to flow inward. American policymakers are acting rationally in pursuit of national interest. But when European firms respond to incentives designed abroad, who ultimately shapes Europe's industrial trajectory? This is not about blame. It's about architecture. Then there is security. Security is often treated as separate from economics. It isn't. Europe relies heavily on NATO, where the United States provides the largest military capacity. This arrangement delivers deterrence and stability. But reliance narrows divergence. If your security umbrella depends on another power, strategic disagreement carries risk. You may speak independently, but acting independently becomes more expensive. Finally, finance. Global trade flows through financial plumbing, reserve currencies, payment systems, sanctions frameworks, capital markets. If the infrastructure that underpins global transactions is anchored outside your direct control, your policy flexibility operates within that framework. Now, critics might push back. Europe remains one of the world's largest economies. It has advanced technological capabilities. It regulates global data standards. Its central banks and financial institutions are formidable. All of that is true, but size is not the same as structural control. You can be large and still operate within systems designed elsewhere. Integration brings efficiency, but architecture determines leverage. If energy pricing is externally influenced, if industrial incentives respond to foreign policy, if defense coordination shapes strategic ceilings, if financial networks define transactional boundaries, then your options become entangled, not because you are weak, but because your decisions are embedded in external systems. And embedded decisions change bargaining power. Real power is not about appearing strong. It's about deciding without needing permission. And that's where alignment begins to look more complicated. If integration into superpower architectures deepens, at what point does efficiency begin to limit autonomy? Let's begin with the United States. For Europe, alignment with America is not new. It rebuilt Europe after World War II. It anchored NATO. It underwrote decades of relative peace. On the surface, deeper alignment looks like continuity, not risk. But structural power is not measured by history. It is measured by control. Start with security. Europe relies heavily on NATO, where the United States provides the overwhelming share of military capacity. This creates deterrence. It reduces immediate threat exposure. It allows European governments to allocate more capital elsewhere. But reliance reshapes leverage. When your security ceiling is defined by another power, your strategic divergence becomes expensive. You may disagree rhetorically, but acting independently carries real cost. Security stabilizes Europe, yet it also synchronizes Europe with American geopolitical cycles. Then energy. After Russian gas flows collapsed, Europe shifted rapidly toward American LNG. Supply stabilized, the crisis eased, but structural pricing changed. For extended periods, European energy costs exceeded those in the United States, and capital is highly sensitive to structural cost differentials. When production becomes structurally more expensive, investment recalibrates. This is not dramatic. It is gradual. Heavy industry does not collapse overnight. It slowly relocates. Now, industry. The United States introduced large-scale domestic incentives for clean technology, semiconductors, and advanced manufacturing. These were rational policies aimed at strengthening American industrial resilience, but capital follows incentives. European firms faced a quiet decision: build inside a subsidized ecosystem or remain within tighter fiscal constraints at home. When production clusters migrate, ecosystems migrate, supply chains shift, talent pools move, strategic capacity relocates. None of this implies hostility. The United States is acting in its own interest. The structural question is different. When security architecture, energy flows, and industrial incentives are shaped across the Atlantic, who ultimately defines the long-term trajectory? Alignment deepens integration. Integration increases efficiency, but efficiency does not automatically preserve autonomy. Europe does not lose immediately. It experiences compression. The margin for independent maneuver narrows incrementally. Protection recalibrates power, and recalibration is rarely visible in headlines. So the question is not whether Europe benefits from the United States. It clearly does. The question is whether deeper alignment gradually transfers structural leverage westward. At what point does strategic partnership become structural asymmetry? Now consider China. If alignment with the United States reshapes Europe's security framework, alignment with China reshapes scale. China is not simply a country, it is the central node in global manufacturing gravity. Over 3 decades, it became embedded in supply chains ranging from solar panels to rare earths to electric vehicle batteries. For Europe, this brought enormous advantages: lower production costs, expanded export markets, deep industrial interconnection. German automakers depend on Chinese demand. European battery supply chains intersect with Chinese processing capacity. Green transition technologies rely on Chinese scale. On the surface, this appears mutually beneficial, but scale changes bargaining power. When critical inputs are concentrated externally, flexibility decreases. Access to scale is leverage. Dependence on scale is exposure. Consider electric vehicles. China controls significant portions of battery processing and rare earth refinement. European manufacturers compete in a cost environment shaped by Chinese efficiency. As competition intensifies, Europe faces a structural dilemma: decouple and absorb higher costs, integrate further, and deepen exposure. Trade exposure adds another layer. China is among Europe's largest trading partners. For export-oriented economies, access to the Chinese market is economically significant. When market access becomes essential, policy choices become more sensitive. Strategic decisions carry commercial consequences, and commercial consequences influence political calculation. China is both partner and competitor. This dual role complicates alignment. Europe cannot easily disengage, but deeper integration increases entanglement. Again, this is not about hostility. China is pursuing its own structural advantage. The structural question is this: when supply chains, industrial scale, and critical materials are shaped externally, who holds resilience during shocks? Power is not only about price efficiency, it is about optionality. Alignment with the United States narrows security flexibility. Alignment with China may narrow industrial flexibility. Neither shift is catastrophic. Both are incremental, and incremental shifts compound. So the sharper question becomes, if dependency grows in 2 directions simultaneously, does integration begin to erode leverage rather than enhance it? Step back. This is not a story of European collapse. It is not a story of American domination. It is not a story of Chinese conquest. It is a story about architecture. In a bipolar system, power concentrates around poles. Everything between them experiences gravity. The United States anchors security and finance. China anchors manufacturing scale and cost efficiency. Europe sits between gravitational centers, and being between them is not neutral. When Europe aligns westward, it integrates deeper into American security and industrial architecture. When Europe aligns eastward, it embeds deeper into Chinese production ecosystems. In both directions, integration increases. In both directions, optionality decreases. Optionality is leverage. It is the ability to choose without disproportionate cost, to disagree without destabilizing your own system, to shift direction without triggering structural shock. As energy flows externalize, as capital responds to foreign incentives, as security frameworks define strategic ceilings, as trade exposure shapes political calculation, power does not vanish. It compresses, gradually, structurally. Some argue Europe can construct a true third pole: energy sovereignty, defense autonomy, industrial revitalization, financial insulation. In theory, this restores maneuverability. In practice, scale is unevenly distributed. Others argue alignment is inevitable. In a system defined by giants, middle powers integrate because fragmentation carries cost. Perhaps the deeper dilemma is not which side Europe should choose. Perhaps the dilemma is structural. Once integration matures, is autonomy still scalable? Supply chains are intertwined, security frameworks institutionalized, financial systems interconnected, disentanglement is costly, deeper integration is constraining. If aligning west reduces leverage in one dimension and aligning east reduces leverage in another, then the real question is not preference, it is feasibility. Can a middle power meaningfully expand its room to maneuver in a system defined by scale? Or does bipolar architecture inevitably compress everything positioned between its poles?